recording. Oh, hey, what's happening? There's the live thing. It always, without fail, just surprises me. I always fail surprise roll. When the surprise check is always a fail. What's happening, wrestling fans? What's happening, Kevin? I'm Doug, and I'm rambling about that little red button up in the corner that always scares me and
and
frightens me and
and I'm
surprises me.
Kevin,
And
and
that's Kevin.
I'm the other bro, and I'm wanting to ramble about wrestling because it's the Two Bros Wrestling Show, not the Two Bros little
Rambling
red
about the red
thing
button
that
show.
tonight, Doug, we're going to be rambling about someone else's show, and that is
Oh,
the Vice production of Dark Side of the Ring. The influence that this has had on professional wrestling, the impacts it's had, have been pretty wide reaching. And so we are going to look at Dark Side of the Ring, a show that I will admittedly say offhand, I've seen almost all of them. I love it. But we do acknowledge that not all is positive. So we're going to look at its effect on the business, whether or not it is a good or bad thing, and as well as maybe fantasy books, some topics that Dark Side producers have yet to capitalize on and are still hanging out there for them.
this sounds like a very interesting show because until we talked about doing this show, I did not realize how many episodes of this there were, and
Yeah,
I'm sure I'm not alone with some of our viewers knowing that there are, what'd you say, 40 episodes of this? My goodness!
40 episodes.
Wow,
Yeah,
this is gonna be a good show.
it will be a good show, Doug, but as with all of our shows, before
Let's
we
open
get to
her up.
that main event, we got an opening bell. We got some news. We're going to lead it off this week with some interesting insight, Doug, into Vince McMahon's role or lack thereof in
Right?
WWE creative. So for everyone who thought that it would just be business as usual with Vince back in the fold, there is proof now that it is a new day for WWE.
Yes, it
No pun
is.
intended,
Yes,
especially
it
for
is.
Vince, who we found out this week, Doug, that the old man has actually been removed from creative decisions by his bosses, which is something that Vince McMahon has never really had before.
So true. And are the rumors true, Kevin, that Triple H has been knighted as the head of creative now?
You know,
It
it shouldn't be a big story considering it is the man's job, right?
right.
But we all saw the difference in when Triple H was completely running on his own and some of the changes that started to occur once Vince was back in the WWE house, uh, looking over Triple H's shoulder. But again, it is a new day. TKO CEO Ari Emanuel is the one who actually made this call to have Vince removed from WWE creative power. And really, Doug, for the reasons you just mentioned, the reported reason that Ari had is pretty plain that we have a man hired to do the job. Let's let him do the job.
Right.
Everyone seems to like the direction he was taking it. He has the respect of the talent. Let's have him do it without interference. Let's let him do this unencumbered. So Vince, butt out. And this is his boss telling him that. So that's pretty, I mean, I know it's a behind the scenes thing, but when you think about the ramifications of Vince
Right.
McMahon being told no about something he wants to do in creative in WWE, that's kind of a big news deal, isn't it?
It's a huge deal. And, it honestly has to be a huge blow to that ego because it's been his for so long, right? He's probably, certainly not just probably, but certainly not used to hearing stop it. And having to stop it. I mean, I'm sure he's heard stop it a lot in his lifetime. But
Well, those are allegations.
oh no, I
I'm
didn't.
sorry. Oh, we should point out though that actually is not unrelated to this story because after a strong start post merger, the TKO stock has been in decline, and at a recent news conference, or at a recent conference, rather not a news conference, Emmanuel he pointed to several factors to those in attendance as to why this would be, and that includes everything from Saudi Arabia's investment in the Professional Fighters League, which is another TKO mixed martial arts venture. But unlike UFC, it is in seasons, more like a traditional sport. Obviously, there's controversy with that, and he thinks that has hurt. He also believes that what's hurt the stock is there being reports that NBC Universal is no longer in the running for Monday Night
Mhm.
Raw. And he mentioned the ongoing federal investigation of Vince McMahon regarding the hush money scandal. Remember that, everybody? that's that's actually still a thing. The federal government is still investigating this. So you when you have your new CEO talking pretty openly about how Vince and what's going on in his personal life could possibly hurt business, it really goes to figure why Ari would have the gumption, I guess, to say that having Vince McMahon backstage handling creative also could be bad for business.
Yeah, because I don't think we've talked about this before. Dana White still runs UFC, and there's a lot out there about Dana White, good, bad, ugly. But I don't think Dana White's ever been investigated by the feds. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but so I think that's the big difference here. I mean, you have Dana White and Vince McMahon, both allegedly not the best humans in the world, but still, at least both of them were the heads of their respective companies after being purchased by Endeavor. But now Vince has been basically dethroned, and the son-in-law. It's almost like a wrestling Game of Thrones at this point now, with all the power plays behind the scenes. Vince goes away, comes back, Triple H moves in. It's very interesting. I cannot wait for the Dark Side of the Ring about all this.
Hey, exactly. I mean,
Right?
exactly. That's on my list of
My-
topics
yeah.
because it is a Game of Thrones. Before we get off the topic of Vince entirely, I have another Vince related story here, Doug, in our opening bell. But a project about Vince's life that many of us thought was dead following his sexual assault allegations is apparently very much still alive. Producer Bill Simmons, who co-created ESPN's 30 for 30 series, he also helmed the HBO Andre the Giant documentary that got a lot of praise. This man has long been linked to the docu-series that was supposed to air on Netflix about Vince McMahon's life. The topic recently came up during a Simmons interview with Bloomberg, and Simmons revealed that the project will be seen through to its completion, though it sounds like instead of a series, it may now be a one-off documentary instead. Either way, the interesting tidbit for me that came out of this is Simmons mentioned that McMahon will get to look at clips of
Hmm.
the series, but he will not be able to give notes before the final cut.
Yeah.
So to me, that's coded language that says we may have updated this for the last year or so of Vince's career, which would include a lot of the controversies, the sale, the allegations, the investigations, and all of that. So we don't know that that is the case, but I think it would be a disservice to do a documentary on the life of Vince McMahon and not
Yeah.
include the way that this story looks like it's going to end for him.
So basically, once again, just to recap the big stories here, Vince has lost creative control of everything he had creative control of, right? I mean, that pretty much is the summary here.
I mean, that's true because I'm sure at one point, because the WWE was cooperating in this, Vince
Right.
thought he was getting to write the story of his life
Sure.
instead of, we'll show you what we've done. We don't want to hear what you think about it.
Hmm.
Makes me
So
more interested for this.
another documentary looking forward to.
We got a lot of broadcast and documentary style news going on tonight's edition of the Two Bros Wrestling Show. Um, let's go from documentaries to video games. How about that?
Ooh, let's do it.
AEW's Fight Forever. Fans, listen up. This is, of course, AEW's first console video game. We have some big updates on the way for the game that released earlier this year. Since it arrived earlier this year, we've already seen updates such as the addition of the Stadium Stampede mode, but soon you're going to be getting some new downloadable content in the form of roster updates. And
Ooh,
while
roster
it's yet to
DLCs.
be said what is going to be included, it's pretty fair to assume that the major recent signings, like say your Adam Copeland's and your Kota Ibushi's, surely have to be making their debuts in this game at some point soon. It was also reported as all of this that there is no real planned sequel at this time for Fight Forever. It's done okay, but the plan really is to let this be the game engine, and the future of Fight Forever is more through downloadable updates as opposed to looking at a sequel to the game, at least at this point in time.
I guess that is a good way to save on cost and development. And I'm just not crazy about the way the game looks. And I can't say that I've actually played the game, but just it's one of those things I had no real desire to after seeing the look. But it is more of an arcade game. I mean, I get what they were going for. It's just not my kind of fighter game or my kind of wrestling game.
For all you serious gamers out there, of which Doug and I, though we like to game, would neither of us consider ourselves gamers. If you are a hardcore gamer, a big consumer of wrestling video games throughout the wrestling video game industry's history, let us know how Fight Forever is playing for you. What you think about it? Drop it in the comments.
Absolutely. I would love to hear what some real gamers think of it, not the casual gamers that you and I are.
Doug, we got more AEW news here.
I love AEW news.
And this one is a really good story to dovetail off of our main event topic from last week, which is still in the archives, folks. Check it out if you didn't get to see it. It was one of the more fun shows we've done in a while. We looked at the history of Hispanic professional wrestling, in particular Lucha Libre. This story relates to that because CMLL has a presence on this past week's Rampage. It is part of a agreement that AEW has made with CMLL. Mystico took on Rocky Romero on Friday night. Tony Khan has now said that this is only the beginning of a partnership between the two organizations. As we noted last week in our history lesson, this is the oldest professional wrestling organization in the world, and now a partner of AEW's. It's interesting because AEW also has a working relationship with AAA, the other Mexican promotion, which complicates things because AAA and CMLL hate each other with such a passion that it is going to cause Tony Khan booking issues. So Tony Khan will be able to use CMLL and AAA guys on the same card, but because of the fact of how heated that rivalry is, there's going to be so many off-limit matches that AEW won't be able to book. Obviously, you're not going to be able to book CMLL guys versus AAA guys. But what you also cannot book, which is even more surprising, if you are a Mexican talent on the AEW roster and you last worked for AAA, even if it's been years, here's an example. Andrade has not worked for AAA in several years, but that was the last Mexican organization he worked for. He will not be allowed to wrestle someone from CMLL because they would be perhaps perceived to still be with some sort of an alliance with AAA. So this is going to be really tricky and interesting to see how Tony is able to navigate having partnerships with two organizations from the same country that hate each other as much as these two organizations apparently do.
Okay, so from the perspective of AAA and CMML, gosh, that's hard to say.
It's hard to say.
It is, I want to go right straight into Punk after my first M there, CMML. But I do get it. You don't want your guys, you're putting over the guys from the other company and vice versa. I get that.
Yeah.
But, it then becomes a much bigger thing because you're in the AEW realm here. So then Tony does have to book, against New Japan guys, right? As long as there are no, Mexican guys that just came from AAA.
Or not just come from AAA,
right.
just maybe, last was associated with AAA in the distant past. It will be interesting, but Tony is nothing if not interesting.
Tony is definitely interesting, and now that he has, the wrestling company that was founded at the beginning of time, as he will promote it.
That's right.
There was the Big Bang, then there was MML, and whatever. I can't do it. CMML. There we go.
let's shift from the promotion that we can't say to just a straight AEW story. One more piece
Yes.
of AEW news, Doug, and it concerns a major announcing change. As you noticed, these past few episodes of Collision, Tony Schiavone is now at the Collision desk on Saturday nights. This is not just a one-off filling in for someone or anything along those lines. It is a permanent change. We found out from Tony Schiavone himself that he had mentioned to Tony Khan he would love to do play-by-play again, thought he might get a gig on Rampage or something along those lines. Instead, Tony gave him the Saturday night job to work alongside of the play-by-play guy they already have in Kevin Kelly and Nigel McGuinness. As you also know, the last match, the main event of Collision, usually features Jim Ross coming out and making it a three-man booth. Now, Jim Ross is still going to come out, but poor Kevin Kelly is bumped from the main event, which he is really the best announcer they have.
Yeah. I like McGuinness, but yeah, Kelly is. So what I'm hearing here is that, you know, even Tony Schiavone had heat with CM Punk. Now that Punk is gone, Schiavone can be in Collision too.
Yeah, exactly. Now we know. And who can have a beef with Tony Schiavone? Come on. Tony's like, I mean, he seems like the nicest dude. Last bit of news, Doug, before we hit our main event topic, and that is this week saw the release of the trailer for Iron Claw.
Yes, it did.
And if you didn't see it, we dropped it on our Facebook feed, so go to our Facebook and you can link to it from there. It is worth watching for sure. The movie on the Von Erich family stars Zac Efron, as well as the Bears, Jeremy Allen White. It hits theaters December 22nd. And it looks freaking fantastic in that trailer, Doug. I don't know if you saw the trailer.
It does indeed.
It looks so
great.
Good.
It really, really does.
Looks like one of those kind of prestige pieces that even if you don't like wrestling, this might actually transcend the business, and people who don't watch the sport will actually go see this movie.
Yes. Yeah, I think so. I think, yes, I do believe so. Because I'm like, wait a minute, that's that guy from that show. I know these faces, but they're like, wait, what am I watching?
Yeah, there's some good people involved, and even in the trailer, you see, you know, the Freebirds and Ric Flair, and everyone looks pretty darn good.
Yes, they do. So good. If you guys haven't seen this, and gals, go check this out. I mean, watch our show first, then go check it out. But
then go check it out on our page. But we got you covered.
Absolutely.
And then we'll see you in the theaters on the 22nd, because I think Doug and I are going to go watch Iron Claw. We got to see this.
Indeed. Oh,
that's right, Doug. And with that, let's talk about
time.
something else people need to see. And most of you who are watching this probably have also tuned into Dark Side of the Ring. Dark Side of the Ring has been around since 2019. It is a Canadian docuseries that is produced by Vice Media. Premiered, as I said, 2019. Just wrapped up its 4th season. I think we mentioned at the top, we're up to 40 episodes, Doug, which is a surprising number. I would not have thought that we have covered that many topics, but
I know. And most of these topics, you know, I thought I'd seen a lot of these. Then I'm realizing, no, I've seen maybe 10 out of these 40.
And it's probably the biggies, right? I imagine that some of the ones you've seen are the ones that, you know, a lot of fans would gravitate to. Your Benoits, your Pillmans.
Well, the Von Erichs, the Bruiser Brody.
Von Erichs.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are some famous episodes, and we want to maybe talk as if, you know, presuming that some of you watching this maybe haven't seen Dark Side of the Ring. If you are unfamiliar, let's talk about the approach, Doug, that Dark Side of the Ring takes. The whole intent, and it's really right there in the mission statements in the title, right?
Absolutely.
It's a look at some of the more controversial episodes in wrestling history. This isn't, you know, talking about, like, you know, the stuff that makes the Warrior Award, although Ultimate Warrior himself is a controversial topic.
Yeah, exactly.
But it shouldn't be a surprise when you're dealing with some of the darker, seedier sides of the industry that there have been many in the business who have taken offense to some of the episodes. I've enjoyed them. I've seen, I told Doug before we went on air, I've managed to see 39 of the 40, so I can speak to nearly all of them. And yes, they do take a bit of a sensationalized sex, drugs, and rock and roll approach, because if you think back to any of these type of series, whether it's the old, you know, VH1 Behind the Music and all, like, this is just the format these shows take. This is the format that touches subjects that we're not going to learn about otherwise, except through like the dirt sheets or the internet or those sorts of things. And much like we were mentioning, Doug, in our news story about the Iron Claw, like it transcending the business, I can see folks being interested in a lot of these stories that have absolutely no interest in professional wrestling itself.
Absolutely. And I think it's so funny that you mentioned Behind the Music for those our viewers like us who are old enough to remember Behind the Music, because I was
Yeah.
trying to explain it to somebody at work the other day, because surprise, we do have day jobs, but unfortunately or fortunately, I mean, it pays for all this stuff. So
That's right.
but the whole concept of the I almost called it Behind the Music, but the Dark Side of the Ring, where it's like behind the music, but it's that one part in Behind the Music is where it sets up the they had it all until and then it goes sideways. But this just pretty much goes sideways from Jump Street and just takes off and spirals from there, which what is it, controversy makes cash or whatever Bischoff book was. I mean, he's right. People don't want to hear about the peace, love, and good happiness stuff. They want to see this gritty underbelly, and I think Vice nails that with the Dark Side of the Ring stuff.
And you mentioned several, like the Von Erich episode. There's a reason that people are going to go watch Iron Claw, and it's the same reason that you would tune into Dark Side of the Ring. You have a family completely decimated by tragedy, and it is so unbelievable that it draws you into, like, if it wasn't true, you wouldn't believe it if it was just a made up fiction. And so many of these stories are like that. Obviously, the Chris Benoit tragedy is just that, a tragedy, but it definitely has a news value to it, as well as of being an interesting, if awful, period of the business, and speaks to the effects of concussions and I mean, there's conversations that are worth having, even if it's somewhat sensationalized. It doesn't mean that it is only for that purpose that this show exists. There's more meat to the bone than just we're going to tell you a bunch of sordid tales.
Absolutely. There's plenty of shoot here. This isn't kayfabe. This is really shoot stuff that's going on. And like you said, there's more meat to it because it does explore as the title says, like you said, man, the dark side of wrestling. When they had it all until things went bad. I mean, yeah, exactly. Until Ric Flair, had one too many drinks on an airplane, and and it starts helicoptering down the aisle or whatever.
So that's a good pivot. Talking about the fact that there is good and bad portrayed in each of these episodes, and there's good and bad to the fact that this series exists anyway. Obviously, Ric Flair isn't going to like that particular episode. Not so great for him. It's a pretty interesting. It's a pretty interesting episode. Let's look at the positives and the negatives, because there are positives and negatives to a series like Dark Side of the Ring existing. And I'm going to start by saying the first positive right off the bat is this is third party produced. It's not WWE. It's not AEW. Many of the documentaries and stories we see as wrestling fans are something that we have had produced by Vince McMahon's regime, and they tell their side of the story. Or it's a sanitized version of the story, or with many of these topics, they wouldn't touch these stories with a 10-foot pole. So many of these stories have not been commented on by WWE at all. Sometimes you might get wrestlers on there on a podcast or something talking about these sorts of things. But these stories told in a really professional, well-produced way are stories that we have not got we get the official word instead of maybe the true word on many of these things when Vince has final edit.
So true. So do you think that, I mean, everybody has a podcast now, but do you think that Dark Side has propelled the wrestling podcast forward? Because I mean, this Dark Side broke in 2019. Podcasts were definitely a thing then, but I think wrestling podcasts, especially with retired, semi-retired wrestlers, has really exploded since then. It's almost like a hopping on point then for these wrestlers to go, hey, you know what? I could do a podcast too and talk about some of these stories, because clearly there's a market for it, and then I bring my buddies on and we, I mean, really, how many wrestlers have their own
Oh,
podcast or their own YouTube channels now where they go back and talk about these stories or and even make complimentary like episodes based off these dark side stories to like follow up on them now. It's spun off
yeah.
its own
Or like
subgenre.
sitting here like these two old
Right.
marks
Well, yeah,
talking about
exactly.
what they're talking about, right?
Yeah.
So they have definitely propelled the wrestling conversation on many of these topics forward. Shoot interviews, shoot tapes were always a thing, but now
Mhm.
that we are in the era of podcasting, I think that what Darkside has done is made um, a more professionally produced product
Right. Yeah.
that does the same sorts of thing the old shoot tapes used to do,
Mhm.
and as such, it is great fodder for the wrestling podcast. And these are topics that have been circulating on podcasts for years, pre and post Dark Side of the Ring.
Yeah.
But when you have Dark Side coming out with these episodes, it pretty much has a cottage industry that can follow it for us to sit around and talk
Yeah.
about what we thought about Dark Side, not just the
Right.
story itself,
Absolutely.
but it brings these things back into conversation. I don't know I mean, podcasting in general has taken off. There's
Yeah.
definitely
Yeah.
an interest in doing these sorts of things as we are doing, as well as consuming it. We both listen to a lot of wrestling related podcasts as well. So I think that having these topics discussed um, is a valid use of time of wrestling fans.
Absolutely. And really, I think some of the younger wrestlers too, because I'm thinking, a lot of the old school guys have gravitated, it seems they've gravitated towards podcasts where like a lot of the younger wrestlers, thinking like your Kip Sabins, your Sammy Guevara's, well, even the elite to some degree, not exactly like spring chickens anymore, but still, they gravitate more towards like YouTube-ish, vlogging type
Yeah.
things where a lot of the old schoolers, like, I'm thinking like Shane Douglas, Stevie Richards, these people have more like podcast related things or even video podcasts. And even Chris Jericho has his like or had his weekly podcast.
Chris Jericho, a narrator for Dark Side
Mhm.
of the Ring.
Exactly. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely an appeal even to those in the business. Although there are some in the business that I know feel that this is not the greatest of things. But before we get to
Right.
those
Right.
people's opinion, though, Doug, uh, it does appeal. Podcasting and Dark Side of the Ring. We mentioned it kind of earlier with the movie Iron Claw. It can appeal to those who have no interest in wrestling. Some of these are just fascinating stories. If you're a true crime person, or
Yes.
I mean, people consume podcasts that are really into the true crime podcast. Most of these do end up dealing with crime, be it drugs or
Murder.
violence or murder. I mean,
I mean,
you know, you don't have to be a wrestling fan to just think some of these stories are so outrageous
so
that they're hard to believe if they weren't actually true.
uh, yeah, absolutely.
So, do you think that it's a good thing that non-wrestling fans may be exposed to the sport of professional wrestling this way, or is this the worst possible way to be exposed to the world of professional wrestling?
What's the saying? Any publicity is good publicity. I don't necessarily think that's true because, you come, I mean, you watch this one about New Jack and you're like, oh, this is what wrestling's about. I got to check this out, Yeah,
Oh, that one on New Jack, man, yeah,
yeah,
that's crazy.
because there needs to be a level set of expectations there, and some of these, depending on your entry point, if you're using Dark Side as an entry point, some of these, your expectations and versus reality are going to be really off base, and then others, there's just so much sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's just such a rock and roll lifestyle that these like, freakish, like carny, like stuntmen, perform day in and day out, especially the old school, the older stories. I don't know if it's a good jumping on point or not. I think it just depends on the jumping on point. Like Benoit, is that what you want non wrestling fans to first be exposed to
I think
as wrestling?
no, no, probably not.
It has its goods and its bads. Just looking through here, if I could even recommend one of these for like, a jumping on point, dude, I don't know the world according to Marty Jannetty. I mean, that seems pretty harmless for the most part, right?
Yeah, until you watch it and he starts, talking about the murder he may or may not have committed. I
Right.
mean, they've been looking for a body just because he wouldn't shut up about it, and he's obviously full of crap. But as are so many of these guys, it should
Right.
be noted that a lot of the people that do appear are folks who maybe are looking to get back in the limelight. Um, but that's not completely the case all the way around. That's right. Thumbs up, Doug.
So
That's right. We're still talking the positive. Okay, a superficial positive, I guess, would be that it's a ratings winner. And,
oh,
the
absolutely.
premiere was the highest rated show in the Key demographic in Vice's history. The season 2 finale, the second part of the final days of Owen Hart, was the most watched show in all of Vice's history. So it has, at least until recently, been a big ratings winner for Vice. Again, whether or not that is a good thing probably depends on your perspective.
Yeah.
Um, I have one more good thing I would like to say before we get to
All right.
some of the negatives, and I
Okay.
think that even if the stories themselves are not positive, it does bring into the light some lesser known stories or forgotten talent altogether so
That's
that people
true.
hear about Gino Hernandez, who, I remember from World Class, but if you weren't around in the 80s, you probably don't know who Gino Hernandez is. Same for Adrian Adonis if you weren't watching wrestling when he
Mhm.
was in the AWA and then moved on to the WWF at the time. I had no idea exactly. He'd been off my radar once he left WWF. I didn't realize how tragically he had passed away, which was just an awful story. But still, it does make you reflect upon and remember some talent that probably shouldn't have been forgotten by the sport of professional wrestling, but
Right.
just sad fact of life is that that happens to talent as time moves on. And many of these folks, these are not all stories about Chris Benoit and Owen Hart and folks that everyone knows. A lot
Yeah.
of these are real niche guys whose stories need to be told and who need to be remembered.
Absolutely. I mean, because I think we'll talk about this later, but one of my favorite episodes is the Bruiser Brody story. The Bruiser Brody one because it's such a fascinating,
Yeah.
just just the way this it all goes down with him. And we touched on this just a little bit last week when we were talking about the colognes from Puerto Rico, but just
Yeah.
and just everything about Brody, through his, career in Japan and how difficult he was to work with and how, it it puts wrestling in a very different perspective too. If you're coming from a like if you're coming from the outside and you're thinking, "Oh, this is all fake," then you watch this and you have these like huge guys talking about how they were terrified to get in the ring with Brody because Brody would kind of an Andre the Giant type. If he didn't like you, he didn't like you, and even if he liked you, you were still screwed because he's going to work super stiff and just beat the crap out of you and send you on
I
your
was
way.
afraid of him as a kid.
Sure,
I
you
was
know.
afraid of watching him as a kid, and he was very believable. But
Well, it's
regardless of
'cause
how,
yeah.
I mean, whether you're difficult to work with or not, you don't deserve to be murdered, right?
No, in the shower. Come on.
In
No,
the
no.
shower. Obviously, one of the better episodes. I know as we talk through all of this, we can highlight some of the ones we really like. That's one I definitely would say is a must see. But the negatives of this series in general, obviously, the Bruiser Brody episode being a good case study there is that this is not rainbows and unicorns. This is definitely not the best of people in some opinions,
Mhm.
who then meets an even worse end that
Yes.
even if you're not a good person, you don't deserve. It just doesn't obviously portray wrestling and wrestlers
Yes,
in
that's what
the
I was
most positive light.
because it really does turn up that whole sex, drugs, and rock and roll thing with a very heavy emphasis on the drugs in so many of these and how things go sideways in these people's lives, because these guys are basically, big physical rock stars anyway. I called them, stuntman earlier because they're going through this choreographed dance night in and night out putting all this damage on their bodies, especially these old school guys who would just keep going, concussion after concussion after concussion, finishing matches, going right back out there, working drunk, working high, going out there doing their thing. That does not paint a very good picture of wrestling and
It,
wrestlers in general.
no, and then it makes it a negative for the business because it does give a black eye to professional wrestling if folks watch that and think that that's what the lifestyle is.
Right.
In the same way that Behind the Music, and then they lost it all. Well, not
lost it all.
Most backstages probably are, men and women like with their families and, their physical therapists getting ready for the,
Sure.
It's not like the Wild West days that are often portrayed. That's not the reality across the board. Not everyone could live like a Gino Hernandez or a Ken Patera and some of these and you wouldn't make it. You wouldn't live very long.
Right.
And unfortunately, there's some folks that do have that sex, drug, rock and roll lifestyle in wrestling. And I guess that is a negative, obviously, is that it tends to glorify that to an extent, but it's not like that wasn't a part of the business in the 80s and 90s, because if you look through that list, to be fair, the majority of these stories on Dark Side of the Ring come from the 80s and 90s. There's not a whole lot of the last 10 years. It is definitely, as Ari Emanuel and TKO and Tony Khan would have that this is a billion dollar business. This isn't like the drugs in the back of the bingo hall. Like there's way more at stake with corporate sponsorships and
$1 billion TV deals. Yeah, absolutely.
It's run more like a business. There's a reason that these stories are almost entirely made up of from the 80s and 90s, because it was definitely a more of a confidence game back then, run by lots of shysters who would look the other way and didn't care what was really going on. And it was the wild, wild west, and sex and drugs were quite prevalent as part of that story. It was the 80s. Everyone was doing cocaine, right?
Right.
I mean, it is part of it. So it's not like it's making that era up. It was a problem that a lot of sports endured during that era, and wrestling was not immune to that.
Not immune to it, because in almost every one of these, I haven't seen them all like you have, but everyone I've seen, or probably everyone you've seen, there's heavy cocaine use. Somebody gets really, really drunk at one point, and there's a lot of pain pills involved. Those three
pain pills.
Because of what they do, and especially what they were doing when there was much less medical supervision on site.
There was no such thing as wellness testing. Back in the
or their medical supervision was a doc traveling with them who could write them a script. Here, go get your pills. Yeah, you do what you got to do.
Which is an episode of Dark Side of the Ring. Vince's steroid trial with the federal government. So they tackle that aspect of the dark side of that business,
right,
and the drug end as well. There's some critics, Doug, and this is I guess a negative too. Critics like Bruce Pritchard has been pretty outspoken here recently, that have slammed the approach that Dark Side producers take on relying on Dave Meltzer so often as a source. Now, Meltzer himself is a controversial figure in the ranks of pro wrestling.
Yeah.
Some just dislike the fact that there's someone who's uncovering things on wrestling that they would rather not have uncovered. But then there are others like Pritchard who claim that Meltzer relies on rumors and reports them as facts, and then claiming that that is what he does on Dark Side as well. Do you think that Meltzer's involvement with Dark Side gives it legitimacy, or do you think that the Bruce Pritchards of the world have a point here, or is Bruce just being a company man and doesn't like someone reporting on the business that's not in the business, brother?
So I tell you what, I think for those who are Wrestling Observer subscribers who hang on the words of every dirt sheet that uses Wrestling Observer as one of their sources, to those folks, it lends credibility. There's probably a much larger casual wrestling fan audience out there who has no idea who we're even talking about right now. And they're like, Meltzer, wait, that's if they're even paying attention to AEW, it's like, wait, that's one of the moves the Young Bucks do, right? The Meltzer driver. That may be their extent of knowing them. So I think it depends on the subgroup of wrestling fan that you are, whether Meltzer's influence is good or bad here. To the casual wrestling fan, they're probably going to recognize Pritchard before they recognize Meltzer. At least
Yeah.
Pritchard's on TV a lot. Oh, that's that guy from WWE. So I think the casual wrestling fan probably falls towards that way. And you're like, well, that scumbag just reporting rumors as fact. So it's one of those hard things to call, because I mean, wrestling fans, we are so tribal anyway, even though the best of us try not to be. I think it still seeps through at times, but I think it really depends. It's just such a roll of the dice with Dark Side too, because there's the good, there's the bad, and somewhere in the middle there's the truth, all of it too. So
and Meltzer's going to have his own critics. He does.
absolutely.
And I'm not here to, verify Meltzer as a credible source in all occasions. I will say that I have always thought it was a really weak argument when someone says that there's no valid form of criticism unless you are in the business.
Yeah.
This idea that you cannot report on the sport of wrestling is saying that, well, a critic of an album doesn't have a right to criticize an album or a movie or whatever. Like, music criticism, movie criticism, wrestling criticism are legitimate professions in and of themselves. You don't have to be on the inside of the business in order to be, oh, he's never took a bump, what does he know?
Right.
That's the very close-minded, really weak argument that somehow by being on the merry-go-round that you are able to see the thing more clearly than the person standing off to the side watching it go round. It's ridiculous and an ignorant assumption.
And do you think that is more prevalent inside the business with a guy like Pritchard, where they're inside the business going, yeah, no, that's not a thing. You can't comment on that. You can't, your sources are bogus or whatever, because they're.
And I think that's probably the way they feel about the Dark Side of the Ring producers. Like, these guys may be using wrestlers sometimes, but they aren't in the business. So who are they to come into our world?
Right. Killing the business. Yeah.
Killing the business.
So yet another generation killing the business. How many times throughout the history of wrestling has
the business died?
Exactly. Somebody came in and killed the business at this point.
Yeah. And for those that think that about Dark Side, I can promise you that the WWE and AEW balance sheets are going to be just fine. Dark Side is not going to affect. And one reason for that is this last negative that I have, Doug, and that is it's just not the ratings winner that it once was. In fact, there was a thought before season 4 that 3 may have been the last season, and then they surprised folks with the season 4. But the first 2 seasons saw real strong ratings, and since then it's been kind of a slide. I know that. Cable in general has had a difficult time. Vice itself has gone into bankruptcy. So who knows what the future is for Dark Side. But one thing they can certainly claim is it's getting harder for them to get participants in these shows. And, one downside to that is that, there are real world consequences now for some people who do participate. So maybe you're not getting your Chris Benoit stories. Maybe people aren't as interested in hearing about the background of, deathmatch wrestling in Japan, things that they don't know as much about, because the high profile subjects, a lot of them have already been covered. So some of these lower rated episodes are honestly on people that most fans, won't remember. Other than really, really old school, hardcore marks. But let's talk a little bit about that, Doug. This fact that maybe because of the topics that we've ran through and the fact that there are now consequences to appearing. So Dark Side episodes oftentimes rely on folks who were there, folks who knew. And many of these folks are either trying to get themselves back in the limelight, or you go looking for a source and it's someone who would like to work in the business again. Hey, WWE, still look at me. And maybe they're not getting, maybe they're just not able to get these folks to participate in the ways that they did before because of the consequences. The plane ride from hell, that's really season 3 there. That's the turning point. and how people and talent view this series. Because lots of folks, from Pritchard to Jim Ross himself, who was in the Plane Ride from Hell episode and had been a participant in these before, has not been since. That episode rubbed so many people the wrong way that I think that's when you start to see the lack of participation, the consequences. I think you hit on it earlier, right? Plane Ride from Hell.
Yeah.
Tommy Dreamer lost his job.
Yes. Yeah. And,
he supported Ric Flair, and that was enough to get him fired from Impact.
Mm-hmm. And, JR, a very well-respected member of the wrestling community, starts to back off of, not feeling comfortable the way things are starting to be portrayed, and is to criticize it, from trying to criticize from a neutral standpoint. Is that because it really didn't play out that way and was sensationalized, or because his memory of it played out differently, and now it paints him what was presented paints him in a bad light? Where do people start to get upset with this? That's not the way it happened, or it makes me look bad because you say it happened like that,
and maybe it's a little bit of both, right?
Yeah, sure.
Obviously people's memories on a subject can,
absolutely.
So maybe a little context first, I guess, in case you don't know what the Plane Ride from Hell was. This episode covers the famous and controversial ride, including interviewing one of the flight attendants who accuses Ric Flair of sexual assault, which is obviously not a light, fun allegation. This isn't just him helicoptering down the aisle. Right. This is an assault accusation. And the producers did actually take a little bit of liberty. So you could say that, that yes, they're somewhat to blame. There are actually incidents that happened in two different plane rides that they combined into one episode. And it makes it appear as if it was just one single plane ride from hell instead of a couple of different incidents. But there's no doubt about it that what make a lot of people mad is not that, which you can definitely question that. It's legitimate to question that was not a great editorial decision. But you do have folks who come out of this looking really bad because of the facts being revealed, and whether it's sensationalized or one person's opinion, to an extent, there were many of these things were based on things that actually happened. Now, whether or not it led to an assault or what, we know that this plane ride did not go. We know that Ric Flair, Jim Ross got, taken to the woodshed over it at the time. I mean, this was stuff that's well known. It's not like they made this stuff up. It just doesn't make anyone involved look very good. And unfortunately, because there was real world consequences, people losing their job, it has had the effect of making folks not want to participate with future stories that they're doing.
Right. It's one of those things where the wrestling myth is presented in a quasi news fashion. So this thing that was wrestling mythology now becomes much more tangible in the real world when it's presented in such a way too, because I think to some degree, like, old marks like us and maybe even the young marks have heard about the Plane Ride from Hell, but not necessarily had it presented in such a concise fashion as it was in this, I almost got it behind the music, in this Dark Side of the Ring episode. And it just it contextualizes it and makes it so much more tangible. Then it goes from myth to reality at that point. And that's, very damaging to careers.
Dark Side, obviously had lightning in a bottle with this one. It may have been the turning point, but to me, it is one of the, if you're going to go out of your way to see a few episodes, that's one I think you need to see.
Absolutely.
The Chris Benoit ones, the Brian Pillman ones. Doug, I don't know if you had any the Brian Pillman ones.
Yeah, the ones you're hitting on, I think I think you're right. I've probably seen the bigger ones, like, or the ones that, like Pillman, Benoit, Montreal Screwjob, Brody, Bruiser Brody. Just looking through here, well, the Von Erichs. I think, I was looking at the list here. The Match Made in Heaven. We got Randy Savage and Elizabeth. The very first one they do. Seen that one. Montreal Screwjob, check. Bruiser Brody, check. Last of the Von Erichs, check. And then, I did not see the one with Gino Hernandez or the one with the Fabulous Moolah from the first season. And their seasons, the episodes are so inconsistent too. because looking at this, there are 6 episodes in the first season. Then you go 10 episodes, 10 episodes, 14 episodes. It starts to bounce around quite a bit.
It does, and then there was a really long break because the producers went and
Right.
focused on Tales from the Territory, which was a bit more of a well-rounded, like these are good old boy stories. Some of them were, dark side type territory as well, but many of them were, just positive stories or just the conditions of the time. So they were definitely more balanced. It wasn't all just the seedy stuff. And then they came back because the demand was there, and fans wanted another dark side, and we got that with this recently ended season 4. We do not know about a season 5. And Doug, considering that we have now more critics on Dark Side than ever, and folks who maybe are afraid to participate, and we've seen a ratings decline, and you have the whole background drama of Vice there as the platform being for sale itself and on the verge of bankruptcy. So it could already be the end of the road. But do you think that the Dark Side series itself has ran its course?
I think it probably has, because like you mentioned earlier, a lot of these stories where they're going to get the most meat out of the stories are from the 80s and the 90s. There are stories, rolling into this century and, up through current day that could make really good dark sides, but I think the people involved with those for the most part are much more social media savvy than their predecessors, so they're a bit more careful about what they do and don't expose, and where they would and what they would and would not say on camera. So I think maybe dark side has run its course.
I have episodes I'd still like to see. I
Okay.
think that there are so many topics that they could still cover,
Yeah.
and that it would be the participation side of
Right.
if anyone is one to. We touched on one earlier. The whole Vince McMahon saga
Absolutely.
is
Yes.
just, I mean, with a bow, like that would get
Mhm.
you some of the highest ratings you've had. You want to bring people back into the fold of watching this, do an expose on the whole Vince McMahon thing once it shakes out.
And
CM
that's
Punk.
yeah.
I mean, CM Punk is a whole
CM Punk.
episode in and of himself. We've done that episode. We have.
We just didn't have the budget to say of maybe we can get a hold of Vice and see if we can do a dark side of CM Punk
That's right.
MMLL.
They should have us forget Meltzer. We've already covered this.
Right.
We will be
Forget
your.
Meltzer.
We got the research. Jeff Hardy, the Hardy Boys. Jeff Hardy's pinned down on his floor in front of his kids by a SWAT team. I mean, there's how many failed chances here? I mean, Jeff Hardy is a walking Dark Side of the Ring episode, and I hope it ends positively, the story, but it's definitely a story that they could cover.
You have a lot more tragic stories too, like Bray Wyatt. This,
Bray Wyatt.
Wyndham Rotunda is such an interesting individual, such a brilliant creative mind that was on again, off again with WWE. Takes this, and then is eventually taken out by COVID complications. Essentially, it leaves behind this beautiful family.
And that's one you can do.
Devastating.
That's not. I mean, that's tragic
It's
without
tragic,
being
but it's not
seedy.
it's not seedy, it's not sensationalized. I mean, yeah, you can sensationalize, the romance. He was married, he meets JoJo on the road,
True.
there's your sensationalism with it. But, it's again such a compelling human story though, where it doesn't take that sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or I'm sure it probably could, but it not to the extreme of say like the plane ride from hell. It's a much more human story, and I think that's what I really like most about these dark side stories is you get to see these human element in these superhuman individuals, even though they're not necessarily portrayed in the best light sometimes.
How about TNA?
Oh man, yes,
The whole
absolutely.
story of
TNA.
the Jarretts starting this up,
Hmm.
with the double entendre of a name, to Dixie Carter and Panda Energy bringing on Hulk Hogan, the failed attempts by
Hmm.
Billy Corgan to purchase it. Like there's a whole story there. Same for Ring of Honor. Their
Absolutely.
time with Sinclair and their Wild West days. How many folks came through Ring of Honor that are now like the best
Yeah.
wrestlers in the world for everyone else? They were an unofficial minor league territory before there was like performance centers and things. You got your talent from Ring of Honor, and then their bankruptcy and sale and resurrection by Tony Khan. There's a story that I think wrestling fans would be interested in.
Absolutely. I really think there's something with the Rhodes family too. You have Dusty, this patriarch.
Yeah,
the patriarch. You got Dustin, you got Cody. There's a huge story there with Cody where he falls out of grace with where he's just known as a good hand, goes off, proves himself, hooks up with the elite, starts a company, returns to WWE as a conquering hero. I mean, there's a story there depending on who it's told by.
I was going to say there's a great documentary on Peacock. But again, who's telling that story?
Exactly.
I love the fact that these are actual third party, not someone that doesn't have a vested interest in how the story's told. I'd like for that person to tell the story on the failed invasion angle back in WWE. I mean, you talk about a historic incident that was just should have been printed money and all the ways that went wrong. You could definitely do a story on that. The demise of WCW, the actual downfall of WCW, and the fall of ECW, which would have all the sex, drugs, and rock and roll you would want there if you look into Paul Heyman in the bounce checks and the ending of ECW. Again, I'm not saying do it from a sensationalized point of view. I'm just saying these are interesting topics that, despite the fact you think that they've already handled all the low-hanging fruit, they haven't touched. This last one I have, Doug, that I think would be an amazing Dark Side, and maybe it's too hot to touch, and maybe because of the nature of Dark Side of the Ring, it is too heavy and serious a topic to handle in the Dark Side format. I think it would make an excellent documentary, though, for someone to do. Can we get a third party to come and do interviews and do the investigation, and let's actually have a roundup of the speaking out movement in the world of professional wrestling?
I was going to say that that's
a story that was never really told. It was definitely a big story in the world of professional wrestling, but whereas the Me Too movement has had movies and documentaries and news coverage, because it's wrestling and it was an offshoot of that, the speaking out movement hasn't had its big rubber stamp moment of here's the definitive story of speaking out and changes or non-changes that resulted from it. I think that's a story that needs told.
I agree totally with that. I was hesitant to mention that. I'm glad you did, because I too I'm not sure if it's the right format for a Dark Side format, because I think Dark Side could get way too sensationalized with that, and
we don't want it to look
less
than legit. It's too serious.
Down the middle investigation documentary would be welcomed, I do believe.
So we do believe that there are stories still to tell if Dark Side is around to tell it.
Yes.
Has it ran its course? Maybe it should, maybe it shouldn't. There's definitely arguments both ways, just like there's arguments as to whether or not it's good or bad for the business. Overall, it is an entertaining watch, and the business is going to be just fine. Yep. What we don't know, Doug, don't know at this time if there's even going to be a season 5 of Dark Side, but if they want to do it, we just gave them lots of booking ideas.
I'm pretty sure we just gave them 10 episodes. You're welcome.
We'll welcome.
We'll take our EVP credits and checks to go along with it.
Checks, please. Yeah. Again, you don't need Meltzer. We are your experts for any topic that you have on season 5. Fans, let us know what you thought of tonight's show. Let us know what your favorite episodes of Dark Side of the Ring are, what you think about the concept in general, if you like it or not, and any other ideas you might have for upcoming editions of the show. Drop all that in the comments below. Doug, with that, we're going to go ahead and hit our big finish. What do you say?
Big finish. Let's do it.
Botch of the week.
So my botch of the week, I want to wrap my botch of the week up with the performer of the week.
Go for it.
So this is just a little combo platter here. So I'm going hard on AEW tonight, but I've already forgot the kid's name. The Nick kid that's with Christian. Christian's his dad now. Nick Wayne. Thank you.
Yeah. Bruce Wayne's kid.
Bruce Wayne's kid. No, he's Christian's kid now, dude. Christian is his dad now.
Yeah.
So his mom, totally performer of the week. Totally performer of the week. Botch of the week, letting his mom be on camera. I mean, I don't know what her background is, but why are you doing that? Come on.
I know. I don't know if it was so bad it was turning the corner to good, or
I mean, when you have Trent Beretta's mom on, yeah, that's a character. That's good
that's
stuff,
fun. Yeah.
right? But
Sue and her cookies. Yeah, I'm
Sue
all
and her
for that.
cookies, but Nick Wayne's mom, no,
And
no, come
I'll be
on.
honest with
She
you.
tried. You know, kudos to her for trying. She put it out there. That's
Trying to
why I'm giving her. Yeah, I
helping out
mean,
her
it's
boy.
exactly. Come on.
I don't like that at the center of this is a real life death,
Right.
and that it gets brought up. That part just makes me just kind of nauseous. Honestly, I just
Mhm.
hate it when they do that. But all sides do that, so I guess that's beside the
Right.
point.
And I'm certain everybody involved has signed off on it. I
Yeah,
see.
I'm sure they have.
I mean, in this day and age, you have to sign. You're not going to get, just, oh, surprise, we're doing this and we're live and it's happening. That's
If you haven't seen Brian Pillman Jr. or the former Brian Pillman Jr. going
right.
off on his dad, I mean, it is a really interesting approach they're taking. Is that I don't know that man. He wasn't around for me. It
Yes.
is so true that I mean, and it's actually captivating stuff. I just don't know if that's where I want to see my wrestling go.
See,
But
okay,
that
yeah,
is go
just as a side note there, I do after seeing Dark Side, you get a lot more of that promo, that Halloween Havoc promo that Brian
yeah,
Pillman Jr. is cutting, and then you understand that the name he's taken in WWE and
yeah.
NXT, Lexus King, is a tribute to the women in his life who actually raised him and took care of him because Dad wasn't around and
I
Dad was
like that.
gone. Yeah,
I normally I don't like when hey,
I
you're
don't
a Pillman. Why are you changing it? You're a
exactly,
Steiner. Be a Steiner.
exactly,
No,
exactly.
they're not running away from who he actually is. He is
Hmm.
giving you all the reasons why
He is.
that is not who he is and
Hmm.
doesn't want to be, which is actually, I mean, you talk about dropping the ball. That's a whole other episode. But man,
Well, yeah,
AEW,
yeah.
you have dropped the ball on this kid.
Absolutely.
Not my
Absolutely.
botch of the week, though,
No.
Doug. My,
Sorry.
my botch of the
Sorry,
week.
that was a bit of a tangent.
No,
Sorry.
no, I went off on a tangent too. But my botch of the week is with wrestling retirements,
Oh, yeah.
especially these long wrestling retirements. First, Daniel Bryan
I know now we
announces
have
he's retiring in a year, 2, 3,
right?
something along those
Yeah.
lines. Sometime before Birdie graduates college or something. And then in this past week's AEW Dynamite, they have been teasing this big announcement from Sting, which we all thought, ooh, is it
Right.
going to be a retirement? It is. He's retiring in like 5 or
Yes.
6 months or so.
Right, right.
And the audience reaction was just that, like, oh,
Oh, yeah,
okay,
okay.
well, I guess see you next week, Stinger. I don't know,
Right?
right?
It's
I
still
mean,
Sting for, a couple more months.
and he did retire before in 2015, so
Mhm.
take all of these announcements with a grain of salt. But apparently his last match will be Revolution 2024, which typically happens in
Was that January?
March or so. There's no
Okay, February.
there's
Yeah, somewhere like yeah.
February and March is when the others have taken place, but
Okay.
we'll see. But
Yeah.
the long goodbye, that's my botch of the week. My performer of the week, my performance of the week.
Nick Wayne's mom?
Not Nick Wayne's mom.
Okay.
I'm doing the Doug thing tonight.
All
This
right.
is somewhat thematic. We've been talking Dark Side of the Ring. We've talked
Okay.
Iron Claw in our opening news segment. I want to talk about a show about the sport of professional wrestling. My performance of the week is Wrestlers, the Netflix series that follows Ohio
Oh.
Valley Wrestling. We mentioned it when it premiered, letting you know that it was out there, that you should maybe give it a shot. I have seen every episode. It
course
is
you
one
have.
of the best produced inside looks on the world of professional wrestling you will ever see. It will make you a huge Al Snow fan. It will show, honestly, if you don't like wrestling at all, the human aspect of what some of there's the kids, you see them and that, man, if they just can keep their head on straight, which is a big if, they have it. And then there are the folks you realize that are just, no one has the heart to tell them that they're fooling themselves. Or there's the older folks who are just like think that they're going to have one more shot at the big
Oh,
time,
yeah.
and it's so compelling and hard. There's Shira from who's here from India, who literally is a fish out of water and the absolute sweetheart. Not if there's anybody you want to see succeed, him and Holly J, you want to see succeed for different reasons. Her because she has a life she needs to escape, and him because he is sending everything he can back to his family in India, and he is just thank you, sir, thank you for all these opportunities, and he's doing everything alone in a completely foreign culture. And the fact that it's, here in the state of Kentucky, and I'm seeing lots of, things I know and recognize from my time traveling the state and being in Louisville, it's just a really compelling watch. I would highly recommend. Doug, this goes for you. If you haven't seen Wrestlers yet, you have to put it on your list.
Who needs sleep? I'm going to binge after we finish this show tonight.
You watch the first episode, and I promise you will go all the way through the 7 before the weekend is out.
Awesome. I've got my homework for this week.
Match of the week, Doug. Do you have anything?
Few years ago, I saw Jay White and Rock Hard Juice Robinson. It was one of my first New Japan shows. I have had the New Japan streaming service. Just got it. Saw them at the Cow Palace. Watched these guys, and I was like, I don't know who these guys are. I know Juice Robinson. He is, CJ Parker from NXT. He's gone on to bigger and better things. Clearly, both of these guys are really, really going to be something. But the Switchblade guy they're talking about, this Switchblade guy is hot. He is going to be something. Let's fast forward to this past Wednesday, where to me, I was so giddy when I saw Penta wrestling.
Oh, I know.
Going to wrestle Jay White. I loved this match. And, and Penta gets protected because, the left hand of God is there to, actually take him out with the distraction. But, this was just sometimes it's just that magic that makes me like giddy, like this little kid, like I am right now, just even talking about it. So for me, that's match of the week,
Yeah, fantastic match. Can't complain about your selection there. I enjoyed it too. I am going to Monday night for my match of the week for two other guys that at one point I would have been so excited to see wrestle on the indies and thought this will never happen on the big stage of WWE. Gunther versus Bronson Reed for the Intercontinental Championship. Two big boys wrestling an athletic style that you normally don't get from heavyweights. It's not the flippy floppy lucha style. It's not the slow WWE like heavyweight style. It's somewhere in between. It was just hard hitting, unique, compelling from characters who a year ago would not be featured on Monday night or Friday nights or in WWE anywhere outside of NXT.
Right. And that's the thing. There is your huge sign that Vince has nothing to do with creative right now. You would have never seen that match if Vince McMahon had anything, any inkling, any sway in creative. That's just a match you would not see.
The second week in a row, NXT had way more female talent and women's matches than men's matches. And it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't like, hey, it's a special episode tonight where we're, doing an all women's show.
We're showcasing the women. Yeah.
Yeah. They have so much talent. There's just swimming in so much talent there that they can feature the women either equally or ahead of the men, and no one blinks an eye. Those are things that people are actually saying behind the scenes are the evidence that these are things that Vince did not like or would not have allowed, and a sign that Triple H is getting his way. And I might note, Marks like Doug and I, we're enjoying these changes. So
we are
good on you, Triple H. That was a great match. Thank you.
And I am a huge AEW mark, but these are things Tony Khan needs to pay attention to. Triple H is running a wrestling company the way a lot of us want to see wrestling ran. And because I don't think that AEW has any less of a women's roster, but they're not getting that love that those NXT girls are.
Not at all, man. Not at all. So, yeah, Tony, that's definitely a lesson that you can learn for sure. And actually, that's a great pivot, Doug, to our end, because as you can see with this, the scroll in the bottom, upcoming shows, please join us next week. You're going to be in good hands with Doug. I will not be on the broadcast, but Doug is going to make sure we have a crown jewel preview.
We will have some sort of fantastic Crown Jewel preview. If you'd like to see
Yeah,
a guest speaker in the drop a comment below, and we'll see what me and my
let us
AI
know. Yeah.
friends could cook up for you.
Yeah, come up with the most outrageous thing you would like to see hosting, and we'll see what Doug can do for
And
you.
we will
Uh,
see. I
but
will
I'll be
accept
back
all
with you
comers.
in the episode after that. That's the pivot I was making with the Tony Khan and his women's
Yes.
division, because that is a whole topic we're going to have on the 5th, Doug. That's an interesting one. This case study of Jade Cargill, who is showing up on every single WWE broadcast. This is going to be a good thesis statement for us on November 5th as to Tony, his treatment of his women's division,
Mhm.
and where he completely did the work that WWE will now capitalize on because he didn't complete that work.
It completely did the work. I mean, you have Cody as the guy who opens the door for things to start flowing back the other way. And you also have Cody who's probably facilitating to some degree or another because yeah, I'm pretty sure Nightmare Factory was very responsible for Jade and Cody bringing her in anyway. So you have that doorway, but Cody is a case study in of himself of what WWE will do with the AEW talent. And now we are elevating because I'm part of WWE's booking team now. All of a sudden, I guess me and Trips are getting together. I don't get checks from Tony anymore. I'm getting them from Paul. So
Yeah.
but we are seeing this elevation of Jade Cargill and making her such a big deal. Such
We
a big deal. But when she finally does something other than just show up somewhere, it's going to be amazing.
and that's where all they have to do now is have her show up. So
Right.
you show up for that show, because it is going to be, we can definitely fill our hour on that one. So come back.
Come back.
Definitely come back and join us for future episodes. We appreciate you tuning in tonight.
Thank
Go
you.
watch some wrestling.
Go watch some wrestling. I'm going to. Good night, everybody.
Good night.